The early Roman army is shrouded by a lack of evidence. Ancient historians' accounts of the history of Rome before it was sacked by the Gauls in 386 BC, 390 by Roman reckoning, are regarded as highly unreliable by modern historians. Livy, the main surviving ancient source on the early period, himself admits that the pre-386 period is very obscure and that his own account is based on legend rather than written documentation, as the few written documents that did exist in the earlier period were mostly lost in the Gallic fire. In the earliest times, when Rome still consisted of separate hilltop settlements, and into the earlier regal period until c. 550 BC, it is likely that there was no Roman army in the conventional sense, but warbands based on the Roman gentes, clans, led by their clan leaders, example the warband of the Fabii, which, according to Livy, numbered 306 cognati et sodales, kinsmen and supporters in 479 BC. In this era, the predominant warfare consisted of chronic small-scale raiding and cattle rustling against other clans and, later, neighboring hill tribes such as the Sabini and Equi. Only occasionally did the clan warbands join together to form a larger force, in order to face a major threat from neighboring tribes. It is likely that the heroic tales in Livy's first three books derive from old ballads celebrating such raids, orally transmitted through the generations within aristocratic clans. At this time, it is likely that Roman warriors, both foot and mounted, were unarmored, carrying only light shields and leather helmets. It appears that the early Roman army in the sense of an organized national force with standard equipment did not become established before the period 600 to 500 BC, when both the ancient chroniclers and archaeology indicate major changes in organization and equipment. The critical changes were the adoption by the infantry of Greek-style hoplite equipment, most likely borrowed from the Greek colonies of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, featuring metal body armor, and the concomitant differentiation of the section of the citizen body who were wealthy enough to pay for such equipment known as the classis, or class, from those who were not and continued to serve as unarmored light infantry, infraclassem, or beneath the class. According to Livy, Romulus, traditional reign dates, 753 to 717 BC, raised 10 centurii, military units of 100 men of infantry from each of the three original tribes of Rome which he had founded, the Rams, Tities and Luceres. Although the Latin term tribus, literally in three parts, is conventionally translated as tribe, the term constituency would be more precise, as they were artificial divisions for administrative purposes. The Romans always used the terms gentes or nations to mean tribes in the sense of ethnic groups, but the establishment of these centurii and even of the tribes themselves is probably anachronistic, and in reality dates from much later in the regal era, probably in the period 600 to 550 BC. The initial 30 centurii were then doubled to 60 in the period around 550 BC, according to the scholar P. Fraccaro's interpretation of the so-called Servian Centuriate organization. Fraccaro suggests that the Servian army consisted of a single legion of 6,000 hoplites, plus 2,400 velites, unarmored infantry, and 600 cavalry. Until recently, Fraccaro's thesis was not widely accepted because of Alfoldi's view of an insignificant early Rome, which could not have supported such a powerful army or cavalry. But with a population now estimated at 35,000 inhabitants, a regal military levy of 9,000 is plausible, and the Fraccaro interpretation has won wide acceptance among modern scholars of ancient Rome. It implies that the Servian citizen body was divided into just three property classes for military service: patricians for cavalry service, landowning peasants for service collectively known as the classis as hoplites, and others for service as velites, infraclassem, or beneath the class. Romulus supposedly established a cavalry regiment of 300 men called the Celeres, the swift squadron to act as his personal escort, with each of the 3 tribes supplying 100 horse. This cavalry regiment was supposedly doubled in size to 600 men by King Tarquinius Priscus, conventional date 616 to 578 BC. That the cavalry was increased to 600 during the regal era is likely, as in the early republic the cavalry fielded remained 600 strong, 2 legions with 300 horses each. However, according to Livy, King Servius Tullius established a further 12 centurii of equites, a further tripling of the cavalry. But this is probably anachronistic, as it would have resulted in a contingent of 1,800 horses, incongruously large since the heavy infantry was only 6,000 strong. Instead, the additional 12 centurii were probably created at a later stage, perhaps around 400 BC, but these new units were political, not military, most likely designed to admit plebeians to the order of knights. An important question is whether the royal cavalry was drawn exclusively from the ranks of the patricians. This is certainly the mainstream view among historians, starting with Mommsen, but Cornell considers the supporting evidence tenuous. If the cavalry was indeed a patrician preserve in the regal era, it probably played a critical part in the coup against the monarchy. Indeed, Alfoldi suggests that the coup was carried out by the Celeres themselves. According to the Fraccaro hypothesis, when the Roman monarchy was replaced by 2 praetores in c. 500 BC, the royal legion was divided into 2, 1 for each praetor, each legion comprising 3,000 hoplites. The velites and cavalry were also split equally, 1,200 velites and 300 cavalry each, for a total of 4,500 men. This remained the normal size of a republican legion until the end of the Social War 88 BC. However, Livy states that a legion at the time of Marcus Furius Camillus, early 4th century BC, consisted of only 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Around 400 BC, according to Livy, important reforms were made. Pay was introduced for levies under arms, both infantry and cavalry, at 1/3 and 1 drachma per day respectively. Although modest, infantry pay was at least sufficient to cover food rations, clothing, and miscellaneous equipment other than weapons and armor, which until then had been borne by the soldier. A seminal innovation of the young republic was the establishment, in c. 493 BC, of an indefinite military alliance with the other city-states of Old Latium, the home of the Latin tribe, to which the Romans themselves belonged. The so-called Foedus Cassianum, Treaty of Cassius, was a mutual non-aggression and defense pact. It required all signatories to assist any of their number who was attacked with all their forces. It also appears to have provided for joint operations in the field. Judging by the provision that the Romans and Latins were to share booty on an equal basis, it is likely that the treaty required the Latins to contribute roughly the same number of troops to joint operations as Rome. It appears that Allied strategy was determined by an annual conference, and that command of any joint forces may have alternated between Romans and Allies. The treaty remained in force until 358 BC and effectively doubled Rome's military potential to c. 18,000 troops, a huge size for Italian armies of the time. Scholars generally believe that the transformation of the early army into the manipular army of the mid-republic took place during the Samnite Wars, which ended in 290 BC. From this time onwards, instead of fielding a phalanx for battle, the Romans deployed a series of small tactical units called manipuli, maniples, arrayed in 3 lines, triplex aces in a chessboard pattern, quincunx. The maniples were basically the old centurii, reconfigured so that those deployed in the front 2 lines of triplex aces were 20 men larger, 120 men, and those in the rear line were reduced to 60 men each. The quincunx offered much greater flexibility and maneuverability than the large, dense mass of a phalanx. It is believed that the Romans copied the quincunx from their adversaries, the Samnites. Other major changes occurred around this time. The demands of the struggle with the Samnites led to the doubling of the normal Roman military levy, from 2 to 4 legions. In addition, the defunct alliance, Foedus Cassianum with the other Latin cities was replaced, probably during this period, by a new military alliance embracing all the states, Latin or non-Latin, that the Romans had subdued by then, called the Socii, or allies. Unlike the Foedus, which was a multilateral treaty or bilateral between Rome and all the other Latin states together, the new arrangements were based on bilateral treaties between Rome and each of a large number of allies. The new system was probably much more Roman-dominated than the Foedus. Strategy was determined by the Roman Senate alone. Joint forces were always levied and command of joint forces was to be always in Roman hands. These measures quadrupled the size of a normal consular army, from c. 5,000 to c. 20,000 men. This period is also regarded by some historians as the most likely time for the introduction of the Servian centuriate organization which underpinned the military levy. The period also saw the introduction of new equipment, including armor for the cavalry and chainmail armor, the gladius, a sword of Spanish design, and the pilum, a heavy javelin for the infantry.